The pre-dawn darkness wrapped around Fort Rucker like a blanket as Sarah Mitchell pulled her weathered 2001 Honda Civic into the military hangar parking lot. It was 5:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in May 2003, and the Alabama humidity was already thick enough to breathe. She grabbed her steel thermos of black coffee from the passenger seat and slung her worn leather tool bag over her shoulder. The bag had been her father's, a man who'd spent his entire life fixing engines and never once apologized for having grease under his fingernails. Walking through the hangar bay doors, Sarah was greeted by the familiar smell of aircraft fuel, hydraulic fluid, and heated metal. The cavernous space stretched before her like a cathedral, and that's exactly what it was to her, sacred ground. 8 Apache helicopters sat in various states of maintenance, their olive-drab paint gleaming under the industrial lights. Each one represented hours of meticulous work, thousands of individual components that had to function in perfect harmony. Sarah knew every single one by heart. "Mitchell, you're early," called out Sergeant Derek Chen, already positioned beneath an Apache's tail section with a diagnostic computer terminal. Derek was one of the few who treated her like an equal, not like she'd accidentally wandered into the wrong bathroom. "Rotor assembly on Bravo 7 isn't responding correctly to the pitch adjustments," Sarah replied, setting down her thermos and pulling out her maintenance log. "I want to run through the entire hydraulic system before the flight crews arrive. If there's something wrong, we catch it before anyone takes her up." Derek nodded approvingly. This was the difference between adequate mechanics and exceptional ones, the difference between fixing problems and preventing disasters. Sarah moved through the hangar with practiced efficiency, her footsteps echoing off the concrete floor. She was 31 years old, though her hands looked older, the skin perpetually stained despite aggressive scrubbing, small scars mapping her relationship with machinery. She wore oversized coveralls that hung on her slim frame, steel-toed boots that had saved her feet more than once, and her dark hair pulled back in a no-nonsense braid. She wore almost no makeup, partly from practical necessity and partly from defiance. In this world, femininity was treated as a weakness, so she'd learned to move through spaces in a way that didn't invite scrutiny. By 7:15 a.m., the hangar began to fill with the day shift. Most of the maintenance crew were good men, dedicated to their work, competent in their roles. But there was an invisible hierarchy that Sarah had learned to navigate carefully. At the top were the pilots, officers in crisp flight suits, aviator sunglasses perpetually perched on their heads, a swagger that came from sitting in the most powerful seat in any military operation. They moved through the hangar like they owned it, often without so much as a glance at the people who kept their helicopters airworthy. Around 8:30 a.m., Captain Michael Foster arrived for his morning briefing. He was one of the senior Apache pilots, decorated and confident, with the kind of easy charm that made junior officers gravitate toward him. Sarah had been working on his assigned helicopter for 3 weeks, replacing a faulty targeting system and recalibrating the entire avionics suite. It was precision work that required her complete attention and her deepest knowledge. As Foster approached his aircraft, Sarah stepped forward with her maintenance report. "Captain, the targeting system recalibration is complete. I've run 17 diagnostic cycles and everything is reading within specifications. The crosstalk between the fire control and navigation systems has been completely eliminated." Foster barely glanced at the documentation in her hands. "Good work, Mitchell. Just make sure it's ready to fly." He said it the way you might compliment someone for doing their job, which, technically, was all she was doing. But his tone carried an undertone of dismissal, the implication that she was a functionary, an interchangeable part in the larger military machine, just like the one she spent her days replacing. "It'll be ready," Sarah confirmed, her voice steady despite the familiar sting of invisibility. After Foster walked away, Lieutenant James appeared at her shoulder. He was younger, maybe 26, and had the particular arrogance of someone who'd never failed at anything. "You know, "You're actually pretty good at this mechanical stuff," he said, as though surprised. "Most women don't have the patience for detailed work." Sarah didn't respond to the compliment wrapped in condescension. She'd learned that engaging with comments like that only extended the interaction. Instead, she turned back to the computer terminal, her fingers moving across the keyboard with fluid expertise. By mid-morning, Sarah had moved on to her current project, a complete overhaul of the primary rotor hydraulic system on Bravo 3. This was her masterwork in progress, the kind of job that separated excellent mechanics from mediocre ones. The hydraulic system was the circulatory system of the helicopter. Without it functioning perfectly, the aircraft was a very expensive paperweight. Every hose had to be inspected for microscopic damage. Every seal had to be checked and replaced if there was even the slightest doubt. Every valve had to be tested individually. She worked with absolute concentration, her mind fully engaged in the complex three-dimensional puzzle of the system. This was where she existed most fully, not in social spaces or casual conversations, but in the intimate knowledge of machinery. In these moments, she wasn't invisible or dismissed. She was essential. Her hands knew exactly what they were doing, moving from task to task with the confidence of someone who'd performed the same work thousands of times and learned something new each time. Around noon, she sat in the break room eating the sandwich she'd packed that morning, turkey, lettuce, no mayo. On the table next to her, three mechanics were discussing the weekend's plans, already moving mentally away from work. Sarah opened the technical manual for the Apache's engine management system instead, the pages already marked and highlighted with her notes. During her lunch hour, while others socialized, she studied flight manuals, system diagrams, emergency procedures, navigation theory. Her apartment, a small one-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood off base, was more museum to aviation than home. Textbooks stacked on shelves, flight simulators, old ones she'd learned on at the community college, framed pictures of different helicopter models, maps marked with military installations across the country. Every spare dollar went toward her dream, her civilian pilot's license and the advanced ratings that might someday lead somewhere. Back in the hangar, the afternoon light slanted through the high windows. Sarah was elbow-deep in the Bravo 3 hydraulic system when she overheard two pilots talking near the coffee maker. "Did you see that new guy in the simulators yesterday? Kid's got real talent, smooth as butter on the controls." "Yeah, natural aviator. Those are the ones you look for. You can usually tell pretty quick if someone's got it or not." They passed within 10 feet of where Sarah was working, and never once considered that she might have something to say about the qualities that made an exceptional pilot. To them, excellence in flying came from an innate quality, something you were born with. They couldn't imagine that years of understanding an aircraft from the ground up, knowing every system, every limitation, every hidden capability, might translate into extraordinary flying ability. At 5:15 p.m., as the day shift ended and the evening crew arrived, Sarah finished her final task. She cleaned her tools with meticulous care, returned them to her bag, and logged out her work. She completed 4 major maintenance tasks, diagnosed and solved a hydraulic pressure anomaly, and trained a junior mechanic on proper seal inspection procedures. Walking to her car in the golden late afternoon light, Sarah looked back at the hangar. 8 Apache helicopters, each one now safer, more reliable, more ready to fly because of her hands. Tomorrow she'd do it again, and the day after that. She was 31 years old, highly skilled, dedicated, and invisible. But beneath the invisibility, beneath the dismissal and the mockery of being just a mechanic, something was burning. A conviction so deep it couldn't be quenched by other people's skepticism. A dream that grew stronger every single day. Sarah Mitchell was going to fly. The decision came on a Thursday evening in September 2003, sitting alone at her kitchen table with a cup of cooling coffee and a pamphlet from the United States Army Aviation Center of Excellence. Sarah read the eligibility requirements for the Warrant Officer Flight Training Program for the 7th time, her eyes tracing the same passages. Open to all service members with high school diploma or equivalent. Vision correctable to 20/20. No age limit specified for warrant officers. Medical certification required. She had everything on that list. She'd maintained a perfect flight line safety record for 7 years. She had civilian pilot licenses, single and multi-engine. Her physical fitness scores were in the 85th percentile. She could recite Apache specifications better than most of the pilots who flew them. What she didn't have was the blind faith in herself that the application required. Sarah set down the pamphlet and looked around her apartment. Every surface reflected her obsession. Stacks of technical manuals, aviation magazines dating back 5 years, photographs of different helicopter models. On the wall hung a framed poster of an Apache in flight, rotors churning against a sunset sky. She'd bought it at a military appreciation event 3 years ago. Beneath the image, someone, she couldn't even remember who, had written with a marker, "Dream bigger." That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in the darkness, mentally rehearsing all the reasons not to apply. The most obvious, she'd lose her current position. 7 years of building expertise, seniority, respect among the maintenance crews gone. If she failed out of flight school, coming back would be impossible. The military didn't forgive failure gracefully, and it certainly didn't forgive women who dared to fail. She'd be radioactive, the woman who couldn't hack pilot training, who'd thrown away a solid career for delusions of grandeur. The second reason, she'd be older than most candidates. At 31, she'd be entering a program designed for younger people with faster reflexes, fresher minds, fewer ingrained habits. Combat aviation culture worshipped youth and aggression, qualities that didn't naturally align with someone who'd spent 7 years in the background, learning to be invisible. The third reason, unspoken but very real, the male pilots would destroy her if she tried. By Friday morning, she'd made her decision, not the safe one, the other one. She printed the flight school application at the base library, her hands shaking slightly as she fed paper into the printer. 50 pages of forms, requirements, recommendations. She'd need letters from her supervisors, her commanding officer, her squadron leader. The political implications were staggering. By asking for recommendation letters, she was announcing her intention to everyone in her chain of command. There would be no privacy, no quiet dreaming. She would be a woman who thought she could fly. The first person she told was Master Sergeant Vincent Cruz, her direct supervisor. She requested a private meeting in his office, closing the door behind her, an action unusual enough that it immediately raised his attention. "Sir, I'm applying for the Warrant Officer Flight Training Program," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Sergeant Cruz, a man in his mid-50s who'd spent 30 years in aircraft maintenance, set down his coffee cup carefully. He didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle, which somehow made it worse than if he'd laughed. "Sarah, why would you do that? You've got a good thing here. You're one of the best mechanics I've ever worked with. You've got job security, respect, a solid future." "I want to fly, sir. I've always wanted to fly. I can't spend the rest of my career on the ground fixing the dreams of other people." "Warrant officers who wash out don't get their old jobs back," he said quietly. "The Army doesn't work that way. If you fail, and you'd be bucking some pretty serious headwinds if you know what I mean, that's it. You'd be separated, starting over somewhere else if you're lucky." "I understand the risk, sir." "Do you?" He leaned back in his chair. "Sarah, I'm not saying this to be cruel. I'm saying it because I respect you. The pilots in this Army don't want to fly with women. The instructors aren't going to go easy on you because of your background. If anything, they'll be harder on you because they'll be looking for an excuse to wash you out. They'll want to prove you don't belong." Sarah felt something crystallize inside her at those words. It was the acknowledgement she'd been waiting for, not reassurance but honesty. The barrier wasn't theoretical. It was real, institutional, and absolutely intentional. "Will you recommend me anyway?" she asked quietly. Sergeant Cruz studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. Yeah, I will, because you're right, you do belong in a cockpit. Just promise me you won't go in there unprepared. Go in there knowing exactly what you're walking into. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah gathered recommendation letters. Her commanding officer was skeptical but professional. Her squadron leader wrote something generic and noncommittal. The maintenance chief, an old-timer who'd seen everything, wrote, Captain Mitchell demonstrates exceptional technical knowledge and physical capabilities. She possesses the dedication required for advanced military training. The applications went in on November 15, 2003. Sarah felt something shift inside her the moment she hit send on the digital submission. There was no taking it back now. The gossip began immediately. By Monday, everyone in the hangar knew. She watched the reactions ripple through the maintenance crews like aftershocks from an earthquake. Some people were supportive, quietly. The women who worked in support roles seemed to understand something fundamental about what she was trying to do, but the reactions from the pilots were different. Captain Michael Foster found her working on an engine assembly. "So I heard you're trying to go flight crew," he said, leaning against the workbench with an amused expression. "That's ambitious." "It's something I want to try," Sarah replied, not looking up from her work. "The thing is, flying isn't like mechanics. It's not a skill you can just accumulate through years of repetition. You either have the instinct or you don't. It's an art form, not a craft." He said it conversationally, like he was sharing wisdom rather than delivering a dismissal. Most mechanics can't make that leap. It's not in their DNA. She kept working. Lieutenant James was more direct. "You've got to be realistic, Mitchell. Flight school has like an 80% washout rate normally. For someone without a traditional aviation background, without that pilot mentality," he whistled low, "you'd be looking at 95%. Worse than the pilot's skepticism was the benevolent concern from senior enlisted personnel. "It's nice that you have ambitions, Captain," an older NCO told her, "but you've got to think about what you're giving up. This job, it suits you. There's no shame in that." Every interaction was designed to push her toward accepting her place, not through overt hostility, but through 1,000 small messages. "You don't belong. You should be grateful for what you have. Reaching for more than you deserve will only result in failure and humiliation." The hardest conversation came with her mother. Sarah called home that first Friday evening after submitting her application. Her mother, Patricia, had spent her life raising 3 children as a military spouse, following her husband from base to base, never complaining about the instability. "Mom, I applied for flight training. I'm going to be a pilot." Silence on the other end of the line. Then, "Sarah, sweetheart, why would you do that? You have a good job, you're stable. Why would you risk that?" "Because I've spent 7 years being invisible, Mom. I'm tired of fixing other people's dreams." The military isn't a place for women to have wild dreams. The military is where you do your job and keep your head down. Your father always said. "Dad would understand," Sarah interrupted gently. "Dad spent his whole life doing something he loved, even when it was hard, even when people didn't respect it." After her mother hung up, Sarah sat in the darkness of her apartment, feeling more alone than ever. December arrived. Sarah continued her work in the hangar with the knowledge that these might be her last months there. She trained junior mechanics with extra patience, knowing that if she succeeded, someone else would have to fill the gap she left. If she failed, at least she'd have left the department better than she found it. The acceptance letter came on December 23, 2003. Sarah held the envelope in her hands for 10 minutes before opening it. Her entire future was contained in those thin sheets of paper. When she finally read the words, "We are pleased to inform you that your application has been accepted into the Warrant Officer Flight Training Program, Class 403, beginning February 2004. Something inside her that had been clenched for months finally released. She was going to become a pilot. She was going to prove every skeptic wrong. or she was going to fail spectacularly, and she'd done it with her eyes wide open. Either way, the barrier was crumbling. The alarm on Sarah's watch read 4:27 a.m. when the barracks door exploded open. A voice, not quite human in its volume, filled the hallway. "You have 30 seconds to get your sorry asses out of bed and into formation. 30 seconds or you start your morning with 50 push UPS. Move, move, move." Sarah was already moving, her feet hitting the cold floor before the last word echoed. This was day 3 of flight school at Fort Rucker, Alabama, and she'd learned the hard way that hesitation was punished with brutal efficiency. She pulled on her PT uniform, physical training gear, with mechanical precision, and jogged down to the parade ground where 24 candidates stood in the pre-dawn darkness, breath fogging in the February air. Captain James Hartley stood before them, his posture so rigid it seemed to defy the laws of physics. He was in his late 40s, with steel-gray hair and eyes that had witnessed decades of aviation and the particular disappointment that came from training people who didn't belong in cockpits. His voice was a weapon he wielded with surgical precision. "Good morning, candidates. I trust you slept well because sleep is a luxury you will no longer enjoy. Over the next 12 weeks, we will separate the viable pilots from the pretenders. We will test your physical limits, your mental fortitude, and your absolute commitment to excellence. Some of you will succeed. Most of you will fail. The question isn't whether you can do this. The question is whether you have the character to even try." His gaze swept across the formation, pausing for a microsecond longer on Sarah than on anyone else. The day began with a 5-mile run in full PT gear, followed immediately by classroom instruction on aerodynamic theory. Sarah's legs burned, her lungs screamed, but she pushed through, sitting in the back row of the classroom and forcing herself to focus on the instructor's explanations of lift, drag, and center of gravity. Around her, candidates made notes. Sarah had already memorized these concepts. She'd studied them for years, but she wrote anyway, maintaining the appearance of a student struggling to keep up. The pattern repeated itself every day that first week. Physical punishment, classroom instruction, simulator training. Each component was designed to overwhelm, to break the weak, to eliminate anyone operating on motivation alone. By Wednesday, 2 candidates had already quit. One was a young man from Georgia who simply walked out of the barracks and never came back. The other, a woman named Christine from Texas, made it to Wednesday evening before admitting she couldn't handle the pressure. "I just can't do this," Christine had said, tears streaming down her face as she packed her duffel bag. "I thought I wanted this, but I can't. I'm not strong enough." Sarah had helped her pack, saying nothing, because any words of encouragement would have sounded like a lie. She wasn't sure she was strong enough either. By Friday of that first week, the doubt had metastasized inside her like a disease. During a simulator session, she'd made a critical error during an emergency landing scenario. Captain Hartley had stopped the simulation and turned to face her, his expression utterly devoid of patience. "Mitchell, you overcorrected on the collective pitch by exactly 2 degrees. Do you understand what happens when you overcorrect by 2 degrees?" "The rotor RPMs exceed the red line, sir," she responded quietly. "Correct, which means you've torn the transmission apart, killed the hydraulic systems, and you're now piloting a very expensive brick falling out of the sky. You and your crew are dead. Good job." He'd turned away from her, addressing the rest of the class. "This is what happens when someone tries to fly on instinct instead of training. You get dead." That night Sarah sat alone in her barracks room staring at her hands. The hands that had built her confidence as a mechanic suddenly felt clumsy, unreliable. She opened her laptop and searched for the withdrawal process. It would be so easy. One conversation with the commanding officer and she could be back to her old job within a month. Safe, invisible, but alive. She pulled up her email draft and stared at the blank message. One click, and she could start typing. She closed the laptop without writing anything. The following week, the intensity ramped up further. The simulator sessions became more complex, more chaotic. Instructors would introduce multiple simultaneous system failures, forcing candidates to manage impossible situations. Sarah failed spectacularly on Tuesday, making decisions that led to a theoretical crash during a mountain flight scenario. On Wednesday, she overcorrected again, nearly stalling the aircraft. By Thursday, she was certain that Captain Hartley had marked her as someone to wash out. She caught him making notes in her training file, his expression grim. That Thursday night, a group of candidates went out to a local bar, trying to decompress. Sarah didn't join them. Instead, she sat in the base library with technical manuals and flight training videos, drilling herself on emergency procedures until the words blurred together. "You should be out having fun," a voice said behind her. Sarah turned to find Captain Robert Chen, a senior instructor, holding a cup of coffee. He was in his mid-50s, with a reputation for being tough but fair. More importantly, he didn't seem to actively resent the female candidates in the program, which made him unusual among the instructor cadre. "I need to understand the systems better, sir," Sarah said. "You know the systems better than half the candidates who have already passed through this program," Chen replied, settling into the chair across from her. "The problem isn't your knowledge. The problem is that you're trying to fly like a mechanic, not like a pilot." Sarah looked at him, confused. "You understand how things work," he continued. "That's an advantage, but you're overthinking every input, compensating too much because you're anticipating problems instead of responding to them. A pilot doesn't think about the mechanics. The pilot flies the aircraft." "How do I stop thinking about it?" Sarah asked. Chen smiled. It was the first genuine kindness anyone in the program had shown her. "You don't. You integrate it. You trust that your training will be there when you need it, but you don't try to solve problems before they happen. You respond to what actually is, not what might be." The conversation changed something fundamental in Sarah's approach. The next morning, during a simulator session, she tried something different. Instead of attempting to anticipate every potential problem, she flew the aircraft, made corrections as needed, and trusted the thousands of hours she'd spent understanding these machines to inform her decisions without dominating them. The simulator scenario went smoothly. No critical errors, no spectacular failures, just competent professional flying. Captain Hartley watched the playback, then looked at Sarah with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Better," he said. "Not good, but better." Better was progress. The following week, Sarah made another breakthrough during a complex night landing scenario. The simulator introduced an hydraulic pressure anomaly mid-landing, a fault that would have caught most pilots completely off guard. But Sarah recognized it immediately, not because she'd flown it before, but because she'd fixed dozens of hydraulic systems in her years in the hangar. She instinctively knew how the aircraft would respond, what compensation the systems would make, and what she needed to do to adjust her flying. She landed the aircraft smoothly despite the fault, the skids touching down with barely a tremor. Captain Hartley watched the playback in silence. When he looked at Sarah, something had shifted in his eyes. "Mitchell, you flew that like you built it," he said quietly. It was the first compliment she'd received in weeks. It broke something open inside her, not the dam of her doubts, but a pathway through them. She suddenly understood that her background wasn't a liability. It was her greatest asset. Over the following weeks, as her confidence grew, the other candidates began to notice. A few started asking her for help understanding aircraft systems. The male candidates, initially dismissive, began to respect her in a different way, not as a woman trying to fly, but as a pilot with an unusual and valuable perspective. By the end of week 6, Captain Hartley called her into his office. Sarah assumed she was about to be told something devastating. Instead, he closed the door and said something that changed her trajectory forever. "I owe you an apology, Mitchell. I came into this program expecting you to fail. I was looking for reasons to wash you out. I was wrong. You're going to be a hell of a pilot, not because you're trying to prove something, but because you actually understand what you're doing. That's rare." Sarah left his office that day knowing she was going to make it through flight school. The barrier hadn't disappeared, but she'd found a way through it, using the very thing everyone said would hold her back. Week 8 of flight training brought Advanced Flying Exercise Week, the crucible where theoretical knowledge became survival skill or fatal mistake. All candidates would spend the week in actual aircraft instead of simulators, performing increasingly complex maneuvers under live conditions. This was where people discovered whether they were actually pilots or just people who'd passed written tests. The weather report for Monday was ominous. A weather system was moving through Fort Rucker, bringing wind gusts up to 25 knots and variable conditions that would make precision flying extraordinarily difficult. The base commander briefly considered canceling the exercises, but Captain Hartley had argued to continue. "We don't get to choose when we fly," he'd said. "Pilots need to know how to perform under challenging conditions." Sarah stood in the pre-flight briefing room on Monday morning, her hands steady despite the electricity running through her nervous system. She completed dozens of simulator flights, but actual flight was different. The aircraft responded with subtle delays that simulators couldn't perfectly replicate. The sensory input was overwhelming: the vibration of the rotors, the hum of the engines, the subtle movements of the controls that required constant micro-adjustments. Captain Hartley reviewed the day's exercises, basic takeoffs and landings, some standard maneuvers, and then, for the highest-performing candidates, a precision landing at a small remote airfield where crosswinds and variable conditions created real challenges. "The remote airfield landing is optional," Hartley said, his eyes scanning the group. "Only volunteers. It's going to be rough out there, and I won't judge anyone for declining. This isn't about proving something. This is about identifying your actual limits." 2 candidates declined immediately. Of the remaining 20, 15 raised their hands for the advanced exercise. Sarah's call sign in the training program was Echo, assigned with the typical military humor that bordered on cruel. Her stick, her pilot instructor, was Captain James Morrison, a lean man in his early 50s with a reputation for being exacting but fair. Unlike Hartley, Morrison had never openly expressed skepticism about female pilots. He was simply professional, demanding excellence from everyone equally. Morrison briefed her on the flight plan. They'd take a US-60 Black Hawk, different from the Apache she'd eventually train on, but fundamentally similar in physics and operation, out to the remote airfield near Mobile Bay. The conditions there would be challenging. The bay created unpredictable wind patterns, the small landing zone offered no margin for error, and the weather system was intensifying. "We'll take it easy the first hour," Morrison said. "Some basic flying to get you comfortable with the aircraft's responses. Then we'll head to the remote field. You comfortable with that?" "Yes, sir," Sarah replied. The Black Hawk's pre-flight check was familiar enough that Sarah could move through it with practiced efficiency. She'd worked on dozens of these aircraft. The layout of switches, instruments, and systems was mapped in her mind. When Morrison nodded approval of her pre-flight, she felt a small surge of confidence. The rotors spooled up, and the aircraft lifted smoothly from the concrete pad. For the first time in actual flight, Sarah felt something crystallize inside her. The theoretical knowledge, the simulator hours, the years of mechanical understanding, it all integrated into this moment. The aircraft wasn't a machine to be controlled. It was an extension of her own intention. The controls responded to her inputs with a fluidity that felt almost natural. "You're doing well," Morrison said over the intercom. "Smooth inputs. You're not fighting the aircraft." For the next hour, they flew standard maneuvers: climbs, descents, level turns, coordinated banks. Sarah performed each one with increasing confidence. The Black Hawk's responses became predictable, then intuitive. She understood how the aircraft would move before she made the inputs, because she understood what those inputs actually did at a mechanical level. By noon, they were approaching the remote airfield. Morrison's radio crackled with weather updates. Winds now sustained at 22 knots with gusts to 35. The airfield was reporting variable wind directions due to the terrain around the bay. "Last chance to abort," Morrison said. "Land here, refuel, and call it a day." Sarah looked out at the weather, genuinely hazardous conditions. Then she thought about everyone who'd said she wasn't pilot material, everyone who'd expected her to wash out, everyone who was still waiting for the moment she'd fail. "Let's go to the remote field, sir," she said. As they approached Mobile Bay, the wind intensified. The Black Hawk began to move in ways simulators never quite captured, subtle drift to the left, then sudden gusts pushing from unexpected angles. Most of the pilots in Sarah's cohort would be struggling right now, fighting the aircraft, making corrections that created more problems. But Sarah wasn't fighting, she was dancing. The remote airfield appeared below, a small concrete pad carved out of scrubland, painted with directional markings. Morrison advised her to begin her approach on a heading of 270, but the wind was pushing from the northeast, creating a crosswind. "Wind is variable," Morrison said, his voice tense. "You're going to need to crab the aircraft to maintain your approach path. Don't overcorrect." Sarah reduced her forward airspeed, adjusting the aircraft's heading into the wind. The Black Hawk's nose pointed slightly left of the landing pad while the aircraft drifted straight toward it, a crabbed approach that most pilots found counterintuitive and dangerous. But Sarah understood the physics. The aircraft's forward motion, combined with its lateral displacement from the wind, created a trajectory that would put her skids right on the mark. As she descended toward the landing zone, a particularly violent gust hit the aircraft from the side. The Black Hawk lurched, and for a microsecond, Sarah felt the familiar doubt, the fear that she'd made a terrible mistake, that she wasn't capable of this. Then something inside her shifted. She felt the aircraft's response to the gust at a level beyond conscious thought. She understood intuitively how the wind was pushing against the rotors, how the weight distribution was shifting, how much collective pitch adjustment she needed to maintain her descent rate. She made tiny corrections, not in panic, but in conversation with the machine. The airspeed indicator showed 20 knots as she descended, 15 knots, 10. The landing zone grew larger in her vision. Wind continued to buffet the aircraft, but Sarah made constant micro-adjustments, each one small enough to be almost imperceptible, each one informed by years of understanding how these machines actually worked. 5 feet above the concrete. 2 feet. The skids touched down with barely a tremor, so smooth that for a moment neither of them spoke. Morrison was the first to break the silence. His voice sounded different, surprised, impressed, changed. "Mitchell, you flew that like you built it." Sarah's hands were shaking as she completed the landing sequence, but she kept her voice professional. "Thank you, sir." They sat in silence for a moment before Morrison reached over and removed his headset, a gesture that meant he was about to say something significant. He turned to face her directly. "I need to apologize," he said. "I came into your training file with preconceptions. I thought you were riding on your mechanical background, that you didn't really understand aviation. I was wrong. You don't just understand flying, you understand it in a way most pilots never achieve. You fly like someone who understands exactly what the aircraft is doing at every level. That's rare. That's exceptional." Over the next 4 days of advanced flying exercise week, Sarah completed every single maneuver requested. She executed precision landings in challenging weather, performed emergency procedures flawlessly, and managed complex tactical scenarios with calm competence. 2 more candidates washed out during that week, unable to handle the intensity. But Sarah advanced. On Friday afternoon, after the final exercises were complete, Captain Hartley called an assembly of all remaining candidates. 19 had made it through the week. He stood before them with an unusual expression, something approaching respect. "Advanced Flying Exercise Week separates the viable pilots from everyone else," he said. "This week, I watched each of you perform under pressure, and I want to recognize one candidate in particular, Captain Mitchell, front and center." Sarah's stomach dropped. Public recognition in flight school was almost always a prelude to washing someone out. But Hartley was smiling. "Captain Mitchell, your performance this week was exceptional. You demonstrated the kind of mastery that takes most pilots years to develop. You have something rare, a complete understanding of your aircraft at every level. I'm recommending you for advanced Apache training immediately. The rest of you will continue with standard progression, but Mitchell will move ahead." As Sarah stood at the front of the assembled candidates, she felt something fundamental shift. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't fighting an impossible battle against institutional skepticism. She was a pilot, and she was exceptional. The whispers that spread through the training program that night were different from the ones that had followed her before. Instead of doubt and mockery, there was grudging respect. The woman who'd been just a mechanic had become something else entirely, a pilot who understood her aircraft in ways that transcended typical training. Captain Morrison became her mentor formally after that day, assigning her to fly with him for the remainder of the program. And for the first time since arriving at flight school, Sarah allowed herself to believe that she was going to make it. The Apache AH-64D was a different beast entirely from the training helicopters. Where the Black Hawk had been a workhorse, reliable, forgiving, predictable, the Apache was a predator. Every system was optimized for speed, firepower, and precision. The avionics were exponentially more complex. The weapons integration required a completely different way of thinking about flight. Sarah arrived at Fort Hood, Texas in September 2004, 9 months after graduating from flight school. She was now Captain Sarah Mitchell, having been promoted upon completion of her warrant officer training. The Apache transition course would take another 3 months, after which she'd be assigned to an operational squadron. Her first instructor, Major Dennis Crawford, greeted her with cautious professionalism. He'd been briefed on her unusual background, the mechanic who'd become an exceptional pilot, and like most senior officers, he was taking a wait-and-see approach. Potential didn't mean actual performance. Flight school success didn't guarantee operational competence. "Your reputation precedes you," Crawford said during their initial briefing. "I'm told you understand aircraft systems at an exceptional level. That'll serve you well here because the Apache is essentially a flying computer wrapped around a weapons platform. But I need you to understand something. Operational flying is different from training. You'll be flying with crews who have been doing this for years. They'll test you. Don't take it personally." Sarah nodded. She already understood that respect in operational squadrons wasn't given, it was earned. The first week of Apache training was immersion in systems knowledge. Sarah spent 16 hours a day in the classroom, learning the hundreds of systems that made the Apache unique. Targeting systems, fire control computers, sensor packages, defensive electronics. Each one was a complex network of interactions. Most pilots learned these systems at a surface level, understanding what they did without deeply understanding how they worked. Sarah approached it differently. She dissected each system, understanding not just its function but its architecture, its failure modes, its limitations. When instructors asked difficult questions, she answered from a foundation of genuine comprehension rather than memorized facts. By week 2, something shifted. The other candidates in her Apache transition class, all experienced military pilots, began asking her questions about systems during breaks. By week 3, Major Crawford was using her as an unofficial teaching assistant, asking her to explain particular systems to candidates who were struggling. "How do you know this stuff so well?" asked Captain Robert Torres, a decorated Apache pilot with 6 years in the cockpit, as they reviewed targeting system architecture one afternoon. "I spent 7 years maintaining these aircraft before I flew them," Sarah replied simply. "When you understand how something is built, flying it is just the next step." The simulator phase of Apache training was Sarah's proving ground. The Apache systems were so integrated that flying it required constant management of multiple systems simultaneously. Pilots couldn't just fly the aircraft. They had to manage the fire control computer, coordinate with crew members, interpret sensor data, and integrate all of that into tactical decision-making. Sarah excelled, but not in a flashy way. She made fewer errors than other candidates, recovered faster from problems, and consistently demonstrated calm competence under pressure. More importantly, she communicated clearly with her crew, understanding their roles and coordinating with them like a dancer with a practice partner. "Your crew coordination is exceptional," Crawford observed after a particularly complex simulator scenario. "Most pilots take years to develop that level of integration with their crews. You're doing it naturally." The transition to actual aircraft came in November 2004. Flying the Apache in the air was fundamentally different from simulators. The aircraft was more aggressive, more responsive, more demanding. Sarah's first flight lasted 90 minutes, and when her feet touched solid ground again, she was exhausted in a way that training had never quite achieved. But she was also exhilarated. Over the next 6 weeks, Sarah completed the required flight hours for Apache qualification. She flew with various instructors, demonstrating proficiency in basic flying, tactical scenarios, weapons employment, and emergency procedures. With each flight, her confidence grew, but more importantly, her understanding deepened. She wasn't just learning to fly the Apache, she was learning to understand it at a level most pilots never achieved. When she graduated Apache transition training in December 2004, her evaluation report contained language that was unusual. "Captain Mitchell demonstrates a complete integration of technical knowledge and flying skill that is exceptional for an aviator at this career stage. She possesses the potential for senior leadership roles within aviation." In January 2005, Sarah was assigned to Apache Squadron 217 at Fort Hood. She would be flying combat support missions, training flights, and eventually, if assigned to a forward-deployed location, actual combat operations. The squadron had 12 Apache pilots, one of whom was Captain Robert Torres, the pilot who'd asked her about systems during transition training. Torres took her under his wing informally, introducing her around the squadron. Most pilots greeted her with professional courtesy but clear distance. She was still the woman who'd come from the hangar, still the unusual anomaly in a tradition-bound community. But then something changed. During her first week with the squadron, the crew chiefs assigned to her aircraft, men Sarah had worked alongside years earlier in the maintenance hangar, recognized her immediately. Captain Mitchell, Master Sergeant Danny Rodriguez, approached her in the Squadron Operations Center, his face breaking into a genuine smile. "No shit, it's really you, from Fort Rucker Maintenance." "Sergeant Rodriguez," Sarah greeted him warmly. "I didn't know you transferred to Hood." "Followed the Apache here 3 years ago," he said. "But listen, we heard about you through the grapevine. You made it through flight school. You made it through Apache training. The whole enlisted crew was proud of you." Word spread through the maintenance crews quickly. The woman they'd trained in the hangar, the one who'd asked good questions and respected their expertise, was now a pilot. And unlike some pilots, she understood their work, valued their input, and respected the constraints and challenges they faced. Over the following months, Sarah's reputation began shifting from unusual anomaly to solid pilot. She completed every assigned mission without incident. She demonstrated exceptional flying skills in training scenarios. More importantly, she communicated differently with her crew, not issuing orders from on high, but coordinating as a partner. During a particularly complex training scenario in March 2005, Sarah's aircraft experienced a hydraulic pressure anomaly mid-flight. Most pilots would have immediately declared an emergency and headed back to base. Instead, Sarah consulted with her crew chief via radio, understood the specific nature of the failure, and used that knowledge to modify her flight profile safely, eventually landing without incident. When she debriefed with her squadron commander, Major Paul Stevens told her something that had profound impact. "That was exceptional flying, Mitchell. You understood your aircraft well enough to use that understanding to solve a problem in real time. That's the mark of a truly great pilot." By summer 2005, Sarah had completed 40 hours of Apache flying, considered the threshold for initial competence. But her record was flawless. 0 safety incidents, consistent positive reviews from instructors, strong team coordination. More significantly, the culture around her had shifted. When she walked into the pilot's ready room, pilots now nodded with genuine respect rather than cautious politeness. When she was assigned as a flight lead, other pilots seemed comfortable following her. When she offered observations about aircraft systems or tactical approaches, people listened. In August 2005, she was selected for the Advanced Tactical Leadership course, a selective program typically reserved for senior pilots with multiple years of operational experience. Sarah was getting in after 18 months in the cockpit. "You're being recognized because you're exceptional," Torres told her when she mentioned her selection. "Not because you're a woman, not because of your background. You're exceptional because you actually understand aviation at a level most of us will never achieve, and people recognize that now." That autumn, Sarah was assigned to teach a series of workshops on aircraft systems optimization. She wasn't formally an instructor, but her expertise was so evident that the squadron commander asked her to lead the sessions. Pilots who'd been skeptical about her when she arrived now attended her workshops, taking notes, asking intelligent questions, recognizing her mastery. By the end of 2005, Sarah had logged 120 hours in the Apache and built an impeccable operational record. She transitioned from being the subject of whispered doubt to being a pilot everyone respected. Not because anyone felt obligated to respect her, but because she'd earned it through consistent excellence. The journey from just a mechanic to respected Apache pilot hadn't been easy, but as Sarah flew through the Texas sky, her hands steady on the controls, her mind fully integrated with the aircraft's systems, she understood something fundamental. She wasn't succeeding despite her unusual path. She was succeeding because of it. Her different perspective, her deep understanding, her respect for crew and systems, these weren't liabilities. They were her signature as a pilot. The email arrived on a Tuesday in February 2010, and it sent ripples of concern through Apache Squadron 217. Admiral Richard Caldwell, Deputy Commander of United States Army Aviation Command, would be visiting Fort Hood for a comprehensive evaluation of tactical helicopter operations. He wanted to observe live training exercises and evaluate pilot performance against emerging tactical standards. To say that the squadron was anxious would be an understatement. Admiral Caldwell was legendary in military aviation circles. At 63 years old, with a 40-year career spanning multiple wars and operational commands, he had the authority to recommend promotions, influence training standards, and essentially shape the future of aviation doctrine. Pilots didn't want Caldwell watching them unless they were confident in their performance. Sarah learned about the evaluation like everyone else, through the squadron's official announcement. She was 6 years into her Apache career, now a senior pilot with over 400 flight hours and an exemplary safety record. She'd been selected for the Advanced Leadership Development Program and was being groomed for command positions. Her reputation had transformed completely from the skepticism of her early days. She was now considered one of the squadron's most reliable and innovative pilots. But an admiral's evaluation was different. Political implications existed at that level that went beyond standard performance reviews. The exercise was scheduled for Friday, and Sarah's name was included in the rotation of pilots who would demonstrate different tactical scenarios. Her assignment was a complex mission profile, a simulated assault support scenario with multiple simultaneous elements. She'd be flying as flight lead, coordinating with other aircraft, managing both tactical elements and crew functions, and demonstrating her ability to make real-time decisions under pressure. Wednesday evening, Sarah sat in the Squadron Operations Center reviewing the mission parameters. The weather forecast showed conditions that would make precision flying challenging, consistent winds of 18 to 23 knots with variable gusts, temperature inversion creating density-altitude concerns. The terrain would be rough, with multiple obstacles and limited visibility in certain sectors. Perfect conditions for showing real skill, she thought, or perfect conditions for spectacular failure. Major Stevens, the squadron commander, approached her desk. "Mitchell, I know the Admiral's presence adds pressure, but I want you to understand, we're not expecting you to do anything special tomorrow. Just fly the way you normally fly. That's what's exceptional about your performance." Sarah nodded, appreciating his confidence even as nervous energy coursed through her. That night, she reviewed the aircraft systems one more time, though she could have recited them in her sleep. She visualized the flight profile, running through contingencies, imagining problem scenarios and her responses. She'd learned long ago that this kind of mental preparation separated extraordinary pilots from adequate ones. Friday morning arrived with clear skies and the promised wind. Sarah performed her pre-flight inspection with meticulous attention, checking every system, every connection, every indicator. Her crew chief, Sergeant Marcus Johnson, a man who'd worked with her for 6 years and trusted her instinctively, watched her work with understanding. "You're going to crush this," Johnson said as she signed off on the pre-flight. By 9:00 a.m., the exercise was beginning. Admiral Caldwell stood with the commanding general and several senior officers in the Tactical Operations Center, watching monitors that showed real-time feeds from all participating aircraft. Sarah had been told he'd be observing, but knowing an admiral was watching your every move had a particular weight to it. Her helicopter lifted smoothly from the concrete pad, and Sarah focused on the immediate task, flying the aircraft with the precision and smoothness that was her trademark. Her wingman, Captain Jennifer Parks, one of the few other female pilots in the squadron, followed in perfect formation. The first 30 minutes of the exercise involved basic tactical movement toward the designated objective. Sarah maintained altitude, heading, and spacing with mechanical precision. She communicated with her crew using clear, efficient language. She coordinated with Parks through hand signals and radio calls, demonstrating seamless teamwork. Then the exercise ramped up. Simulated threats appeared on their sensors. Sarah made the correct calls, executing defensive maneuvers while maintaining formation integrity. She coordinated with air defense assets and other supporting aircraft, her decision-making precise and informed. As they approached the primary objective, a simulated assault landing zone, conditions deteriorated. The wind gusted suddenly, pushing the helicopter laterally. Most pilots would fight the aircraft, making larger corrections that would be visible and somewhat clumsy. Sarah made micro-adjustments, tiny inputs that corrected for the wind without disrupting her overall flight profile. To an observer without her level of skill, it would look like the wind simply didn't affect her. The landing zone was in difficult terrain, with obstacles on 3 sides. Sarah began her approach, descending gradually while constantly adjusting for wind and terrain effects. Her eyes tracked multiple instruments simultaneously: altitude, airspeed, descent rate, wind information, while her hands made constant micro-adjustments to the controls. In the Tactical Operations Center, Admiral Caldwell watched intently. Next to him, the commanding general made a comment about Sarah's approach. "She's managing that wind beautifully," Caldwell said quietly. "Most pilots would be visible fighting the aircraft, She's barely moving the controls." "That's Captain Mitchell," the general replied. "Exceptional pilot, former aircraft mechanic, which gives her unique perspective on systems integration." Caldwell's eyebrows raised slightly. "Former mechanic." "Yes, sir. Unusual path to the cockpit, but she understands her aircraft at a level most pilots never achieve." The helicopter touched down with barely a tremor, skids settling onto the concrete landing zone so smoothly that it was almost imperceptible. Caldwell leaned forward, watching the monitor intently. Sarah conducted the simulated assault sequence flawlessly, managing weapon systems, coordinating with ground forces, maintaining situational awareness across multiple information streams. When a simulated system failure occurred, a hydraulic pressure anomaly, she immediately adapted, understanding instinctively what the failure meant and how it would affect her aircraft's performance. She just compensated for that hydraulic failure without panicking, Caldwell observed to no one in particular. She understood exactly what was happening. The second approach to the landing zone was even more challenging. The wind had shifted direction, creating a new set of variables. Sarah adjusted her approach heading, crabbing the aircraft slightly to maintain her desired ground track. The helicopter descended smoothly, controlled, confident. As she touched down the second time, Caldwell stood, his expression thoughtful. The exercise continued for another hour, with Sarah executing additional complex scenarios. She demonstrated perfect crew coordination, exceptional decision-making under pressure, and flying skills that transcended the technical proficiency most pilots achieved. More importantly, she demonstrated understanding, a complete integration of aircraft systems, tactical awareness, and flying ability that suggested not just training but genuine mastery. When Sarah returned to the landing pad and powered down her aircraft, the exercise was over. She completed her post-flight check and went through the debriefing procedures, unaware of how profoundly she just impacted Admiral Caldwell's assessment. That afternoon, Caldwell requested a private meeting with Sarah. She walked into the squadron commander's office to find the Admiral standing casually, reviewing some files on the desk. "Captain Mitchell," he said, extending his hand. "I wanted to debrief with you personally. That was exceptional flying today." "Thank you, Admiral," Sarah replied, shaking his hand firmly. "I've been evaluating military aviation for 40 years, he continued, studying her face. "I've watched thousands of pilots perform, and I want you to understand something. Today I observed what I would call mastery, not just proficiency, not just training. Mastery. You don't just fly the Apache, you understand it at every level. Your decision-making is informed by genuine comprehension, not just memorized procedures. You coordinate with your crew like you've worked together for decades. And your flying itself is exceptional." He paused, his gray eyes intense. "Captain Mitchell, I'm going to be direct with you. You are the finest Apache pilot I have ever seen." The words hung in the air like they were written in light. "I don't make statements like that lightly," Caldwell continued. "And I mean it in the most absolute sense. Not fine for your experience level. Not exceptional for a woman. Finest. Period. You have something special, a complete integration of knowledge, skill, and instinct that most pilots work entire careers to develop, and you've achieved it in less than a decade." Sarah felt something inside her shift. Not relief exactly, though there was that. It was more profound, a fundamental validation, not just from a superior officer, but from someone with the authority to know exceptional when he saw it. "What are your career aspirations?" Caldwell asked. "I'd like to command a squadron eventually, sir. Maybe eventually work in policy or training development. I want to help change how we think about pilot development, to emphasize the integration of technical knowledge and flying skill." Caldwell nodded slowly. "You'll get those opportunities, and you'll change how people think about aviation, that much I'm certain of." After he left, Sarah sat in the Squadron Operations Center, her hands still slightly trembling. The most powerful person she'd ever met had looked her in the eye and told her she was the best at what she did. Not good, not exceptional, the best. For a woman who'd been told for years that she didn't belong in the cockpit, those words were transformative in ways she couldn't yet fully understand. The Admiral's statement didn't stay private. By the end of that Friday afternoon, everyone in the squadron knew that Caldwell had called Sarah the finest Apache pilot he'd ever seen. By Monday, the entire Fort Hood aviation community knew it. By Wednesday, the statement had rippled through Army aviation command networks across the country. People who'd been cordial but distant suddenly became actively respectful. Officers who'd shown her professional courtesy now sought her expertise. Pilots who'd previously viewed her as unusual now talked about her as an exemplar. The invisible woman who'd spent years being overlooked had become suddenly, undeniably visible. But Sarah remained fundamentally the same person she'd always been. That was the remarkable thing about her. Success didn't change her core character. She didn't become arrogant. She didn't use her newfound status as a weapon. Instead, she became more thoughtful about how she used the platform that had suddenly been given to her. Within 3 weeks of the Admiral's visit, Sarah was selected for the Senior Leaders Course, an intensive program typically reserved for officers with 10 or more years of experience. She was completing it at 6 years in. The selection made official what the Admiral's statement had already declared. Sarah Mitchell was on a fast track to senior leadership. The course was rigorous, designed to prepare officers for command positions. 70% of the participants had been in the military for 15 years or more. Sarah, at 38 years old with 6 years as a pilot, was one of the youngest in her class. But she approached it with the same thoroughness that characterized everything she did, absorbing strategic concepts, studying military doctrine, learning the political and bureaucratic complexities of leadership at senior levels. By the course's end, the other participants had learned who she was. Most were impressed. Some were resentful. A younger woman advancing faster than they'd advanced, selected for opportunities they'd had to wait years to access. But resentment couldn't change the fundamental reality of her competence. In June 2010, Sarah was promoted to major. It was early in her career for the rank, another signal that she was being fast-tracked towards senior positions. More significantly, she was selected to serve as the chief pilot for her battalion, a position that gave her oversight of flying operations and pilot development for multiple squadrons. It was in this role that Sarah began to have the impact she'd always envisioned. The first thing she did was establish a formal mentorship program for junior pilots, particularly women entering the aviation field. She understood from personal experience that pathways to excellence weren't obvious in a culture that had been exclusively male for decades. Women entering aviation often didn't know how to navigate the informal networks that drove advancement. They didn't have natural mentors who understood their specific challenges. Sarah changed that. She created a structured program where junior female pilots were paired with experienced aviators, both male and female, who would actively coach them through the complexities of military aviation culture. More importantly, she made herself available to young women pilots who wanted to discuss their career trajectories. A second lieutenant named Amanda Chen came to see her one afternoon, nervous and uncertain. "I'm thinking about leaving," Chen said quietly. "I'm not sure I belong here. Everyone else seems so much more confident, more natural at this." Sarah recognized herself in that statement. "Amanda, I'm going to tell you something that someone didn't tell me when I was starting out. You don't have to fit the mold of what a pilot is supposed to be. You just have to be excellent at flying. And if you're excellent, people will eventually respect that, even if it takes longer than you'd like." "How did you stay?" Chen asked, "when everyone doubted you?" "I didn't think of it as staying," Sarah replied. "I thought of it as proving something, not to them, to myself. Once you stop needing external validation and start focusing on internal excellence, everything changes." Chen stayed. And over the next 3 years, she became one of the finest pilots in her cohort, partly because of her own ability, and partly because Sarah had given her permission to be herself instead of trying to fit into a predetermined shape. The mentorship program expanded. Sarah began offering workshops on advanced tactical flying that were open to all pilots, but were intentionally designed to be inclusive. She modified curriculum to emphasize the integration of systems knowledge with tactical flying, essentially codifying the approach that had made her exceptional. Pilots who'd never thought about the mechanical aspects of their aircraft suddenly understood how that knowledge could enhance their flying. In late 2010, a journalist named Michael Torres reached out to Sarah about writing her story. Torres worked for a military magazine with significant circulation, and he was interested in profiling pilots who were changing aviation culture. Sarah was hesitant about the publicity. She'd never sought attention, and media scrutiny made her uncomfortable. But Torres was persuasive. "Your story matters," he told her, "not because you're a woman, but because you came from an unconventional path and you've achieved mastery through a different approach. That challenges assumptions about how excellence develops, and people need to hear that." Sarah agreed to the interview, with conditions. She insisted that the story focus on her methodology and philosophy, not just her personal journey. She wanted the article to be useful, to actually change how people thought about pilot development. The article, titled "From the Hangar to the Cockpit: How a Former Mechanic Became the Army's Best Apache Pilot," appeared in the March 2011 issue of Military Aviation Quarterly. It received significant circulation within military circles and even caught the attention of mainstream media outlets. Suddenly, Sarah was getting requests for interviews, speaking engagements, appearances at military academies. Women interested in military aviation were seeking her out. She became, without having sought it, a symbol of overcoming institutional barriers and proving that excellence transcends gender. The attention was complicated. Sarah never wanted to be tokenized as a woman pilot who made it. She'd always resisted being defined primarily by her gender, but she also recognized that visibility mattered. If young women saw someone like them succeeding, they were more likely to believe they could succeed too. She began accepting speaking engagements, carefully choosing ones where she could actually influence policy or culture rather than just tell her story. At the Army War College, she spoke about integrating technical knowledge into pilot development. At the National Defense University, she presented research on unconventional pathways to excellence. At military academies, she talked candidly about the barriers she'd faced and how they could be dismantled. More importantly, she used her platform to advocate for systematic change. She worked with the Army Aviation Center of Excellence to reform pilot training curriculum, pushing for increased emphasis on systems understanding and technical integration. She participated in diversity initiatives, not just because she believed in helping women advance, but because she believed that diverse perspectives actually improved military effectiveness. "Different backgrounds don't just help us be more inclusive," she'd say in presentations. "Different backgrounds make us smarter. When you have people approaching problems from different angles, you get better solutions. My background in maintenance gave me skills that traditional aviators didn't have. That wasn't a liability, that was an asset." By 2012, Sarah had been promoted to lieutenant colonel, another early promotion signal. She'd been selected to command an Apache company, first the operational unit, then ultimately a full battalion. She was on the path to become one of the highest-ranking female pilots in Army aviation history. But perhaps more important than her rank was her influence on culture. Junior female pilots referenced her in interviews about why they'd stayed. Senior leaders cited her research on pilot development when advocating for curriculum reforms. The mentorship program she'd established was being replicated at other bases. Sarah never claimed to have solved the systemic barriers that women in military aviation faced. She was realistic about how slowly institutional culture changed. But she recognized that she could accelerate that change, using the credibility she'd earned through exceptional performance to advocate for structural reforms that would help others. One afternoon in 2012, a young captain named Rebecca Martinez, a pilot Sarah had been mentoring, stopped by her office. "I wanted to thank you," Martinez said. "I was going to quit last year. I didn't think I belonged. But you showed me that not fitting the mold doesn't mean you don't belong. It means the mold is wrong." Sarah smiled. "That's exactly right. And someday, when you're in a position to influence things, you'll do the same for someone else. That's how change actually happens, not through grand gestures, but through one person at a time deciding that excellence matters more than conformity." Standing at the window of her office, looking out at the flight line where Apache helicopters were being prepared for operations, Sarah reflected on the journey. From mechanic to pilot to respected leader, it wasn't a linear path, and it wasn't easy. But every step had prepared her for the next one. The girl who'd studied flight manuals during lunch breaks had become a woman who was changing how the entire military thought about aviation. The invisible mechanic had become impossible to ignore. And the best part was just beginning. By 2015, Colonel Sarah Mitchell commanded the 2nd Battalion, 17th Aviation Regiment at Fort Hood, a position that gave her authority over more than 700 soldiers and 64 Apache helicopters. She was the highest-ranking female pilot in Army aviation history. More remarkably, she'd earned that position not through quota systems or diversity initiatives, but through a progression of demonstrated excellence that had become undeniable. On a Tuesday morning in May 2015, Sarah stood in the Battalion Operations Center, watching her pilots conduct training flights. One of those pilots was Captain Amanda Chen, now a senior Apache pilot with 300 flight hours and a reputation for exceptional technical skill. Another was Major Jennifer Parks, the woman who'd flown as Sarah's wingman during her pivotal Admiral's observation flight. Parks now served as Sarah's operations officer and was being groomed for command herself. The transformation of aviation culture at Fort Hood over the past 5 years had been tangible. When Sarah had taken over the battalion, women represented about 12% of the pilot roster. Now, they represented 21%. More importantly, women were advancing and being promoted at rates equivalent to their male counterparts. The invisible barriers that had once existed were being systematically dismantled. But the real impact extended far beyond statistics. A young second lieutenant named Maria Rodriguez approached Sarah's office during lunch. Rodriguez was nervous, fidgeting with her flight helmet. "Colonel, I need some advice," Rodriguez said. "I'm being offered a position at the Army War College. It would mean leaving flight status temporarily. I'm worried it'll derail my aviation career." Sarah gestured for her to sit. This kind of career question came to her regularly, junior pilots seeking guidance on how to balance different opportunities with their primary passion. "Tell me why you want the War College position," Sarah said. "It could lead to policy work, potentially help shape how we train pilots, how we think about aviation culture. But I love flying. I don't want to give that up." Sarah smiled slightly. "You know, I had a similar decision point early in my career. I could have stayed focused purely on operational flying. But I realized something important. I could have more impact through multiple roles than through one role alone. The flying never leaves you. But if you can influence how the entire system develops pilots, you're potentially helping thousands of people." "Did you regret it?" Rodriguez asked. "Leaving flight status even temporarily?" "Not for a second, because I went back to flying. I've maintained active flight status throughout my career, and my time in policy work made me a better pilot and a better leader. The skills inform each other." Rodriguez nodded, absorbing this. "So you think I should take it?" "I think you should take it," Sarah confirmed. "And when you're at the War College, I want you to think about how your experience as a pilot can inform policy discussions. That's where real change happens, at the intersection of operational knowledge and strategic thinking. Rodriguez left with a clearer sense of direction. In 3 years, she would indeed go to the War College, and her thesis on pilot development methodology would become influential in Army aviation training circles. This was Sarah's work now, not just flying, though she still maintained her pilot certification and flew regularly. Her work was creating pathways, opening doors, and helping others see possibilities they hadn't previously imagined. The mentorship program that had started informally in 2010 had evolved into the official Army Aviation Women's Leadership Initiative. Sarah didn't run it directly anymore. That would have been impossible given her command responsibilities. But her fingerprints were all over its structure and philosophy. The program now operated at 12 major installations and had helped more than 300 women develop their aviation careers with intention and support. At the Army Aviation Center of Excellence, Sarah's research on integrating technical knowledge into pilot training had become standard curriculum. What had once been her unique advantage, her deep understanding of aircraft systems, was now being systematically taught to all pilots. The result was measurable. Aircraft safety incidents had decreased, pilot competence assessments had improved, and emergency response effectiveness had increased. More subtly, the culture of pilot training had shifted. Younger pilots were being encouraged to understand their aircraft deeply, not just operate them. They were being taught to think about systems, to anticipate problems, to integrate technical knowledge with flying skill. Some of Sarah's methodology was incorporated into every Army aviation pilot training program in the country. In the summer of 2015, the Army Chief of Staff visited Fort Hood specifically to observe Sarah's battalion. General Michael Vaughn spent an hour in her operations center, watching training flights, reviewing safety records, and discussing her leadership philosophy. "Your safety record is exceptional," Vaughn observed. "How are you achieving that?" "Through a combination of rigorous training, psychological safety for pilots to admit uncertainty, and an obsessive focus on understanding systems," Sarah replied. "We train pilots to be curious about why things work, not just how to operate them. When you understand the why, you make better decisions in ambiguous situations." Vaughn nodded slowly. "This approach, it's different from traditional aviation training." "It's different because I came from a different background," Sarah acknowledged. "My perspective as someone who maintained these aircraft for 7 years before I flew them informed everything I do as a pilot and commander. I think the military should be intentional about bringing diverse perspectives into aviation, not just for representation, but because diverse perspectives actually improve performance." That conversation led to a broader initiative. The Army began deliberately recruiting people with non-traditional aviation backgrounds, mechanics, engineers, people with technical expertise who might not have the typical pilot profile. The hypothesis was that their different perspectives could enhance overall aviation effectiveness. By 2018, Sarah had been promoted to Brigadier General, a 1-star rank that placed her among the most senior officers in military aviation. She was assigned to Army Aviation Command Headquarters, where she worked on policy, doctrine development, and strategic planning for the entire aviation community. Her focus remained on pilot development. She worked with the Pentagon to establish new curriculum standards emphasizing systems integration. She advocated for mentorship programs to be formalized across all aviation units. She pushed for diversity initiatives that emphasized merit-based advancement while actively removing systemic barriers. Not everyone appreciated her advocacy. Some senior officers resisted changes to traditional training approaches. Some believed that her emphasis on mentorship programs and diversity initiatives was politically motivated rather than operationally necessary. But the data told a compelling story. Units that followed Sarah's mentorship and training models had higher retention rates, lower safety incidents, and higher readiness scores. Women trained under her models were advancing at rates equivalent to men and were demonstrating equivalent or superior performance. The integration of systems knowledge into pilot training was producing noticeably more competent aviators. By 2020, Sarah had published 3 papers on aviation training and pilot development that were used in military academies and war colleges. She'd been asked to consult on aviation culture for a documentary about women in military service. She'd given keynote addresses at multiple international aviation conferences. But perhaps her most important work was invisible to the public. A full list of the women who'd advanced to significant positions in military aviation under Sarah's mentorship would have been impressive. Captain Chen was now a major, selected for command. Major Parks had been promoted to colonel and was overseeing aviation training for an entire region. Lieutenant Rodriguez had returned from the War College and was developing policy recommendations that would reshape how pilots were trained across the Army. Beyond those she directly mentored were the women they'd mentored, creating a multiplier effect that extended Sarah's influence across the entire aviation community. Every pilot that Captain Chen mentored, every training improvement that Colonel Parks implemented, every policy recommendation that Major Rodriguez developed, all of those carried traces of Sarah's philosophy and approach. In 2021, at 59 years old and with 36 years of military service, Sarah made the decision to retire. She could have stayed longer. The Army was eager to keep her, but she felt the natural arc of her career reaching its conclusion. Her retirement ceremony was attended by generals, pilots, maintenance personnel, and many of the women whose careers she'd shaped. Admiral Richard Caldwell, now retired himself, attended and spoke about seeing her execute that perfect landing in 2010, recognizing immediately that he was watching someone exceptional. In her retirement remarks, Sarah spoke not about herself, but about the system she was leaving behind. "When I started flying, women in aviation were novelties," she said. "We were interesting stories, tokenized as symbols of progress. What I hope I've helped create is a system where women in aviation are simply pilots, evaluated on merit, advanced based on performance, and integrated fully into the culture of military aviation." She paused, her eyes scanning the room full of people whose lives she'd influenced. "The greatest compliment I could receive would be if, in 10 years, it became unremarkable that a woman was leading a battalion of Apache pilots. If our achievements were normalized rather than celebrated as exceptional, that would mean the system had truly changed." Standing in her dress uniform with 3 stars on her shoulders, Sarah Mitchell embodied something profound. She was a mechanic who'd become a pilot who'd become a leader who'd transformed an entire culture, not through protest or complaint, but through consistent, undeniable excellence. The grease that had once stained her hands as she worked in a military hangar had given way to stars on her uniform, but she carried the lessons of that hangar, the meticulous attention to detail, the respect for how systems actually worked, the understanding that real excellence required deep knowledge, into every decision she made as a senior leader. Her legacy wouldn't be measured by her rank or her awards. It would be measured in the careers of the pilots she'd mentored, in the policies she'd influenced, in the culture she'd shifted. It would be measured in the invisible barriers she'd dismantled and the pathways she'd created for others to follow. Sarah Mitchell had spent her life proving that excellence transcends gender, background, and unconventional paths. And in doing so, she changed what was possible for everyone who came after her.